Hello, hello. Here we are again for another podcast for the American Meishan Breeders Association, the Meishan Edge, highlighting the unique advantages of the amazing Meishan pig. You've got me, Laura Jensen, the president of the Breed Association, and joining me today is, as usual, my co-host.
Hello.
Yep, Jonathan Kemmerer is here. He's our head of research. Been that way since pretty much 2020, I think, right? Aren't we probably in our fourth year of that?
I don't even remember when that started.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was about the time I took over because, there's so much going on with this breed. And that's kind of the point of the podcast is we want to make sure that we're talking about, the different things that you guys are asking for and sharing what we know. As I've told many people, we're writing the book as we go, which is exciting and can be scary. But I think all of us longtime Meishan people kind of like that. We're enjoying that and learning every day. So today we're going to tackle the subject of feeding. That's a hot topic in pigs right now in general, I think. I think with cattle, they figured out cover crops and all that sort of thing. And I think people want to do it with pigs. It was certainly a topic at conference. A lot of people wanted to do, was it soy-free, wheat-free? Is that kind of the trend that you see, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of trends, whether it's organic, non-GMO, pasture-based, entirely grain-free, sometimes corn, soy-free. I mean, like you said, it's a big discussion right now.
Yeah, it is. And I remember me sharing my feed program. I feel like I've got the boring one because I just use Nutrena feed. But it works for me. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about is why do you pick your feed? What do you need to look for in it? Where do you buy it? How do you plug into the market trends in your area and what it may mean for you? So, Jonathan, I'm going to definitely depend on a lot of your great knowledge there as far as the science side of it. So what do you say? We jump right in with what do you feed as far as ingredients, proteins, amounts, things like that?
Yeah. So I feed, and I have fed a variety of things over the years. Mm-hmm. But I do mix my own feed just because I like having different kinds of feed for different groups of pigs. So I buy corn from my local mill, and then I use, it's called Purina ProBuild GF concentrate, and that is basically mostly soy protein, but it has basically all of the mineral, probiotics, and the other things that you need to make a complete feed. So you basically mix it with corn or other grains, and you have a complete feed.
Wow, is that just for pigs? That's a really interesting product.
Yes, it's pig specific.
All right. Is it a high protein, like a top dressing type thing, or?
Yeah, I want to say on its own, it's about 36% protein.
Wow.
So how much corn or grain you mix it with is how you determine the final. So for example, I'll feed as high as 18% to my youngest pigs, but I only want about like 12% for mature boars and sows. And because that's the more expensive ingredient, it's a lot more expensive than corn. I save money by not having the same 16-18% protein for everybody.
Well, I feel like I could make a whole show just talking to you about this. So you're feeding 18% to your young ones. I know we'll get into some of this breakdown later. And then is there something on this bag that says it's, kind of gives you the formula? Do you have to be able to work in tons, for example, to use this?
I kind of just work in ratios.
Okay.
There is a tech sheet that comes with it that tells you how to mix to get different protein levels or for different, like suggested rations for different groups. But if I look at it and it's basically, one bag of protein, 150-pound bag to 200 pounds of corn, that's a 1-to-4 ratio, and I can kind of work by volume, just a bucket full of the protein to 4 buckets of corn or something like that. But I've also been mixing in other grains. I use Milo sorghum when I finish pigs as a finish diet. Because it doesn't have as much omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, and that's one thing I've been working on is producing a lower omega-6 pork. The trick about sorghum, though, is that the commercial varieties are red in color, and what's red is that gives them that color is tannin, which is kind of an anti-nutrient. And so you can't include it at too much of their diet. Otherwise, it blocks their absorption of protein and stuff like that. But the benefit of tannin is that it's anti-parasitic. That's actually what's in like chicory root that makes it anti-parasitic. So for my youngest pigs, I'll mix up to about 20% sorghum and up to 20% oats into their feed, and then the other 60% is the Purina soy meal and corn, basically. And so by having the oats and the sorghum, you get a little bit of like an anti-parasitic in their diet. The other benefit of oats is that it has a specific kind of soluble fiber, which is really good for their gut microbiome. That's what's going to help them be more naturally disease resistant, and it's also going to help them digest more fiber when they get older. And so you want the combination of the prebiotics, which is the fiber in the oats, and probiotics, which are in the Purina feed that I feed them.
I have so many questions.
Sure.
So can you say the name again? Because I think people listening to this, like me, are saying Purina what? Could you, what's this?
It's called Purina ProBuild GF Concentrate for swine, grower finisher. And so I'm actually looking at the ingredients list right now. The specific probiotics are Bacillus subtilis. Bacillus is a big family of bacteria. I'm sure you're familiar with it from curing. That's Bacillus. There's also dried Aspergillus orzae. And then there's another kind of bacillus that I can't even begin to pronounce.
That's okay.
But you are starting to see this in more and more feeds. I know Fertrell uses them. And so they're kind of generally referred to as probiotics.
Okay, so this same blend from Purina is being used, like you said, by Futrell, so you can get it in other feeds. Because one of my things is I hear what you're saying. I don't know how to go get these things. I'm 40 miles east of Atlanta, and I feel like it hurts me on resources. So if somebody wanted to do this or start that or go find, are you buying it by the ton? Are you buying oats by the ton? Or is this a 50-pound bag somewhere? Or what's that look like?
The corn I buy in like 2,000-pound, what are called super sacks. They're kind of like basically big PVC bags that hold up to like 2,000 pounds at a time. I can also get the Milo sorghum in bags like that. I'm working on buying oats like that. But you can find oats at most feed stores because people feed them to their pigs. They are going to be a little bit more expensive, but that's why I only feed them to the young pigs, because that is, as we'll get into it, that's when feed is really critical. And at the same time, little pigs don't eat a lot, so I'm not needing as many pounds of that as if I were feeding it to larger, older pigs.
Now, it's my assumption that when you start talking about these 1-ton bags, and I've used them, it's a whole different setup, in my opinion, of how to manage and maintain and feed out of them. But I've always had to go to a feed mill. Are you saying that some feed stores, just like your average, feed store down the road that carries the whatever 5 lines of whatever they do, they can get these things for you too?
I would imagine. I mean, my store, it's an agricultural supply, so it's like where my local corn farmers are getting like their seed and chemicals. And then they also sell bulk grains to people that are like raising cattle and have horses and goats and all of that. They're not like your local chain tractor supply store kind of thing. It's a local feed mill.
Okay, so you do need to be in a heavier ag area. So what it may be worthwhile is people can drive to them as they're trying to design their program. Find a more rural area to make the plan to go get it. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and that's one of the reasons I stick with my Nutrina. It works. I can feed it to everything here. My feed store stocks it for me. They're also a Purina dealer, so but Nutrina is what I have found in my whole time with the Meishan. It's just been the best feed for me, and it is nothing fancy like what you've got. I'm envious of your program. Because it's a really cool one. I would
be interested to see the label. I wouldn't be surprised if you found some of those probiotics in it. I think they're a big enough feed company. They're working with that technology. But I think you also make a really great point. I run a pretty big herd. I keep more breeding stock than I actually need just to have more genetic lines available. And I think for the average person that just has a single breeding pair or a trio and raises the offspring, I think if you just go have, 16% protein bagged for you, I mean, what you save yourself in labor and headache and all of that is worth it. I think for the average person, just going and getting a 16% mix is probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and for me, I've worked in the 1-ton bags, and I just don't have the capacity. I don't have somewhere to store them. I don't have equipment that can move them. To get them means that I have to use my stock trailer, which is also my hauling trailer, to store them. And then it comes down to, as far as the way is, I'm trying to figure out how to say it, as far as my farm hands and things like that, it becomes such a technical program that it's not realistic for where I'm at with that. Not that that's not meant negative at all. They're amazing. It's just, it's definitely a more advanced program than I can really do here. And you're right, I brought my feed tag with me. I have dried aspergillus. Is that it? And it's got some sort of fermentation extract.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll go Neutrina.
So,
cool.
And I think you made a really great point that I always talk to people about when it comes to feed for a small farm. There's no standardization. I don't think there's any one thing that's best, and that's really what you have to analyze. Is what equipment do you have on hand? Do you have equipment do you have a loader that can lift 2,000 pounds? Do you have an extra flatbed trailer? Do you have a shed or a barn that you can store that in? And you kind of have to base your feeding around that. And also physical ability. How comfortable are you throwing around 50-pound sacks, or bucketing out of the super sacks?
Yeah. Now let me throw something else in here. People ask me all the time what I feed, and what they generally ask are what are the profiles? What's the protein level? What's the fat and the fiber? Those are the three things that I think we all generally look at.
Yep.
But what I find is that people take that and then they apply it to their market and their area and their availability, and they pick a different brand of feed, and they don't get the same results that I do. And I think that's just something that needs to be said, that feed quality is something to consider significantly. And if you don't like the way your pigs look, even though the feed should be all you need, make a change, and maybe it's just time to deworm. That's always one of those things. As wet as it's been around here, we definitely need to deworm. The worm load's something we've got to stay ahead of, and just winter wetness. But not all feeds are the same. Just because it has the same percentage of proteins and such, always work on developing your eye is what I'd like to add there.
Yeah. So how much are you feeding different groups? Like if you have a young piglet, or you have a sow that's not bred versus a sow that is bred versus like a mature boar, about how many pounds a day are you feeding these different pigs?
Mature boar, sow that is not heavily bred, and even weaned piglets. My formula generally is 3 pounds per day per pig. Now, where that varies is if it's the last 2 foundation boars that are back here, and I know that they seem hungry. I evaluate all the time. Weather's coming, things like that. They need 4 pounds some days, so I don't necessarily hold them to that. I know on Make Mine Meishans it was asked about sows and what do you do there. I think, I want your opinion too, Jonathan, but I think a couple weeks before farrowing, probably 10 days for sure, they need to be on free choice. They're hangry, they're trying to build up and get ready for farrowing. I always find that they go off the feed right before they farrow, and usually within about 2 days of farrowing, they're coming back on it. And then the other side of that is I think it should be free choice because they are making all the milk, especially if it's a big litter. And I have fed like 20 some pounds to a sow at one time, just to make sure she had what she needed, and when I come back in a few hours, it's gone. So I think it has to vary based on the stock. Now, what I want to know also about your program on the flip side is I think you do a free choice feed for a certain age, and that you're actually using gravity feeders in some places. And I had always thought that generally that would make for fat pigs, but it's about timing, or tell me about that.
Yeah. So first of all, I completely agree with you. And in fact, I have an old, it's the Morrison's Guide to Feed and Feeding from probably like 1940s, but that was the agricultural standard for most of the 20th century. And I remember it saying that a lactating sow needs something like 18,000 calories a day. And so I completely agree. And then there's also the swine production book that I talked about at the conference that kind of shows the critical feeding times. And it's the end of gestation right before a sow farrows, and the pigs, the amount of milk that the sow can produce and the quality of feed that those little piglets have, that is the most critical time you will feed pigs. That's when you will see the best return on investment for the feed that you buy. So what I mean by that is, like, we talk about the conversion rate, that, how many pounds of feed do you have to give a pig for them to gain a single pound? And when they're little piglets, it's really good. It's around 2 or 3. As they start getting older, you need to give them 5 pounds to gain a pound of line weight. And then it's 7 pounds of grain to get a pound of live weight. Well, that number can change depending on malnutrition. So for example, if a 150-pound pig needs 5 pounds of grain to make 1 pound of pork, essentially, if that pig had been malnourished as a piglet, or if the mom had been malnourished while she was pregnant, instead of 5, that could be 7 pounds.
Interesting.
Like, they won't grow as quick and they won't grow as efficiently when they're older if they're malnourished when they're young, or even when the mother's pregnant.
So that's a question that I was asked early on, and I think I'm grateful for my old school farming raising. It comes back around now, and it was a situation where Meishans were very, very thin, and it was a herd sell-off, and a member reached out to me and said, "What would you do?" And my answer was, "We just don't really know if the pigs can ever recover." That would be my concern, that because they were thin up to the point they were going to buy them, you can't necessarily go back and unwind that clock and make that right and make the breeding stock viable. And sounds like that's actually kind of the scientific side of it, that yes, that is the case.
Kind of. I don't think that would rule out those pigs as being good breeding stock, because again, what Max talks about, genotype versus phenotype, that's a phenotype thing. They're smaller because they were malnourished. That doesn't mean that they will create offspring that have a worse feed conversion.
So if you flip them, once you get them, and the sow has all the feed and she has all the nutrition for her litter, then it can change the path going forward.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is, if you have this 150-pound pig that was malnourished, it needs 7 pounds of grain to gain a pound of live weight, versus the pig that wasn't only needs 5 pounds.
Okay.
Well, if that pig that was malnourished, that is more efficient, if you raise that gilt up and breed her, you're not going to see a difference in her offspring versus others in terms of their efficiency.
Okay.
Right? That's an environmental thing. It's not a genetic thing.
Okay. Thank you
So
for clarifying.
they're gaining slower because of environmental issues, not anything that affects their genetics.
Yeah. Okay. I definitely see that. I think in some extreme cases, yeah. Thank you. Okay. So
the other part, I guess we were talking about sows. So yeah, I'm in the same boat. I feed sows, and that's also when we were talking about breeding. That's why I don't leave boars in with sows for the last 2 months of their pregnancy. If I leave them in for 2 months, that's long enough to know that the boar did its job, and if it didn't, then one of those two have to go. But for the second 2 months, I only want, bred sows, because I want to be able to feed them more and not be wasting high quality feed on a pig that doesn't need it, the boar. And then, I'm free choice the entire time that they're nursing. And not just because they're nursing, but also because, that's when the babies are starting to eat. And regardless of whether or not, it's enough for the sow to make enough milk or for the little ones to get enough, I don't think you can overfeed pigs at that stage.
I don't think you can either. It always shocks the farm hands at how much they can go through, and it is because the piglets are starting to eat too. So, absolutely. Now, your free choice plan. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I free choice pigs until they hit about 150 pounds, and for the Meishan, that's about 4 to 5 months. And so that's the feed I was talking about a minute ago, where it's about 60% corn and soy with the Purina soy additive, and then I feed up to 20% oats and 20% Milo sorghum. And so that's just a great well-rounded feed. It has some anti-parasitic stuff, it has prebiotics, it has probiotics, it has protein, it has all the things that they need, the minerals, the amino acids. And the reason for that is because from the extensive research I've done on their ability to digest fiber, that doesn't really start until they get to be about 150 pounds.
Okay.
And so, because to back up more, I mean, my goal has always been to use the least amount of grain and to rely on forage and byproducts and other stuff to use the least amount of grain possible. But what I've learned over the years is that that's not reducing as much grain as possible as early as possible. And so by giving them free choice of this, I'm getting them to the size where they don't need grain anymore a lot quicker, a lot more efficiently. Like I said, when you malnourish them at the young age, you're not helping yourself further down the line, you're hurting yourself further down the line. The prebiotics and the probiotics make sure that they have a gut microbiome that can really well digest fiber, which they're not going to have if they're deficient. And then when they hit that 150 pounds, I'm putting them with the older pigs where they have access to, 3 or 4 acres of pasture, and I may be only feeding them, bucket feeding them anywhere from a half pound a day up to 3 pounds per pig per day, just depending on the quality of forage.
Okay. Random question. Is there an advantage for me to take my Nutrina feed and do a top dressing with this Purina grower finisher? Or is that duplicating too much?
I don't think so. I think what you're feeding, if we were to look at the feed tags, it's probably a lot of the same ingredients with a lot of the same makeup.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that means your setup is you probably have farrowing, of course, and then you've got a weaned pen for these grow outs, and then you have an adult grow out pen. What does that look like?
I have an adult grow out pen that is actually split into 2 adult grow out pens.
Okay.
And like I was saying, I like to finish pigs for the last 8 weeks without any corn in their diet at all. And so not always, it just depends on the time of the year and what grains I have on hand. Sometimes I'll separate out, whatever pigs are going to the butcher in 8 weeks and give them a more specialized feed.
Okay, interesting. Why no corn for 8 weeks?
Because the research shows that is the amount of time it takes to significantly change the fatty acid profile of pigs. So what the research showed was that on a corn-fed diet, they had an omega-3 to 6 ratio of like 1 to 14. If for 8 weeks you substituted different grains, you could drop that down to like 1 to 8 or something like that. And so the setup I have, I think I've talked about this before, it's a hog panel fence. It has shelters, it has automatic waters. That's where I bring their food. And then from there, I can set up to 3 or 4 acres of pasture using electric fence. And then rather than rotating them across the field, I just give them access to different areas from a centrally located pen.
Nice. So like the wagon wheel type
Something
deal.
like that.
Yeah, that's a great setup. I'd love to split my big. I've got a 3.5 acre pasture. I call it that's my big pasture here. I'd love to split that in half and do this. When I wean, they just go into the grow out pen. But this is a great, great explanation and helpful for me to realize that it could help. And like you mentioned, also as far as labor and things like that, you're only feeding them however long the feeder holds. So that could be.
But your pigs are on some kind of pasture most of the time, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they always have hay bedding, so there's always something for them to eat.
And they will snack on that.
Yeah.
From what I've noticed with hay, it's like they eat the leafy bits and they leave the stemmy stuff behind.
Yeah, yeah.
Or sometimes you'll even see them. I see them do this with pasture too, where it's like they chew it up to extract like juices or something from it, and then they just leave the other stuff, like they just spit it out when they're done.
Like a cud, huh?
Yep. Something like
That's
that.
funny. Yeah. Cool. All right. So I feel, as far as like the what do you feed, I think we've probably covered all that.
Yeah.
I think we had a member that Jonathan you mentioned as we were outlining this. Rebecca Thompson shared a chart and how she feeds. Did you want to touch base on that for members too?
Yeah, if I can remember it, I think her rule of thumb is that she basically feeds. So this is if you're going to bucket feed, and if you're not going to give like free access or a bulk feeder or something like that. I think she basically just feeds 1 pound per month of age per pig. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a 2-month-old pig that you just weaned gets 2 pounds per pig per day. When they hit 3 months old, they get 3 pounds per pig per day. Mm-hmm. You know, so on and so forth until you hit, I think 5 months old, she caps it at 5 pounds and doesn't feed more than that, or maybe even cuts back. I think she even cuts back sometimes to 4 pounds when they're out on pasture, because she actually seeds her pastures and they can get quite a bit of their
yeah, I know we've got her and another member that are big on alternative feeds, and hopefully they'll join us on here, maybe on the next one or here soon, so that we can get their perspective too. All right, well, cool. That kind of leads into the next thing as far as the basics of feeding. I know that Rebecca's a big fan of fermenting feeds as far as soaking her feed, and I love that too. For me, it is not a viable option. People, it's kind of like when we were feeding food scraps. The reality is it's very hard to hire somebody to feed food scraps because it's perceived as trash, and people don't want to touch that. And ferment's the same thing. It really takes a situation where you as the farmer can manage the ferment and keep it going, and that's just not something that fits my timeline. What are your thoughts on ferments, Jonathan?
I'm kind of in the same boat. If people don't know, I used to make wine, so I'm familiar with like the process of fermenting. And to do it with consistent results, you need to have a temperature controlled room. And so that's kind of what's always been my biggest hang up, is that, and you know, it takes a minimum of, I want to say, a couple days. So you have to have a room large enough to store 3 days worth of food for your whole farm, with consistent temperature season to season. And you know, out here in the Midwest, where I think it's currently hanging out about 1 to 2 degrees and we'll hit 100 this summer, I you know, that would, so it's, there's the infrastructure, then there's the labor. It's the same with like sprouts, because people feed, you know, some people sprout their grain and feed microgreens essentially. And that's kind of the same thing. Like, it's, you take the cost of feeding grain and then you add into it extra labor and infrastructure. And with sprouts, you need something that's completely rodent proof, or the rodents will eat all your sprouts. So I do soak mine. Sometimes I'll even soak it overnight, but I'll at least soak it before I bring it out. And part of that is because I get wheat middlings from a bakery flour producer that I mix into the feed, and I find that it just makes it more digestible for them. It also keeps me from having to fill up their waters as much, because most of the water they need is for digesting it. So it, for what extra labor there is, it saves me labor because I'm not filling their waters as much. But that can also be an issue with feed, is that feed that's ground too fine for pigs can actually cause lacerations on their stomachs.
Interesting.
There's a certain like parts per million grind level that you're supposed to grind feed. And so it's just like an extra precaution. I find that if you waterlog the feed, you don't have that issue as much. It just, in general, you lessen the chances of them.
How interesting. I know I don't really like a powdered feed because I just feel like it wastes so much. And
they choke on it and inhale it too.
That's true. And what I can get is for those large breed pigs. It's got candy in it. And we don't need that. So The best prosciutto I've ever had was when I could get milk whey from a local dairy, and that was the nastiest process. We had to keep a IBC tote in the bed of the truck or move it in and out, and then you're managing. It was a 275 gallons, and then you're managing that. And then the pumps to pump it back and forth. And then, of course, in summertime, all the wasp, hornets, and bees that wanted to be around it.
Yeah.
But what I would do is I just had a lawnmower trailer at the time, and I would fill up my 5-gallon buckets halfway full with grain and then top it with that, and it would expand. The pigs themselves had a great finish on them. And like I said, the prosciutto was phenomenal. That dairy moved. But for me to find somebody to handle that now, it just can't happen. It was just too gross. So
yeah, and I don't say this to discourage people, because I think with sprouts you actually do yield more than you know 1 pound of grain ends up being the equivalent of like 2 pounds of feed. I'm sure there's various benefits to fermenting, like the probiotics. It's kind of like we were talking about at the outset, why you don't use the big totes or mix different feed for different groups. It's what works for you is not going to work for me, and it depends on our, what infrastructure we already have, what, our various abilities, our time, and all those different factors. I think the best feed program is always going to be different person to person, farm to farm.
And I think that's something that's not talked about enough. It is exactly that. And if you're good at making microgreens, maybe you sell them. Then cool, you got the thumb for it. It fits your program. It makes it great. But I think in the homesteaded movement of late, or the farmer movement of, well, I don't know that it's just of late. Honestly, it's supposed to be. There's this person that has the all the right answers, and you should be able to go and do it because somebody else is doing it. And like you're saying, John, that's just not reality. Maybe it's not your skill set. Maybe it doesn't fit anything you do. And to evaluate what works best for you, no matter what you're raising, is really important.
Yeah. And at the same time, your market, too. It's the same when people ask about organic or non-GMO or non-corn soy. If you're doing something that is more expensive, you need to be sure you have a customer base that is willing to pay extra for a more costly process.
Yeah.
That, or maybe you are a homesteader, maybe you're just producing food for your family, and so you're not relying on sales. Like, it's not a business, you're just producing food for yourself. You need to understand, is this a hobby, is this self-sufficiency, is this a business, and make your decisions accordingly. But if you are doing it as a business, you need to make sure that you have customers that are willing to pay more money for a more expensive product, because it's a more expensive process.
Yeah, I learned that early on. I had like 5 people tell me they wanted non-GMO fed pork, so I spent the money and did it. And when the pork went into market, none of them bought any of it, and the customers that were here didn't care. I recently spoke to a member in South Florida about a similar situation. He's getting some traction under him, and sending some pigs to the processor, building his market, getting some good connections with different stores that want to carry the pork. And he had someone reach out and say, I would buy your pork if it was organic, if you fed them organic. And his question to me is, should I do that? And I shared that story with him, that people are happy to spend your money for you. And if it's not your market, if it's not you, in this case, because of South Florida, it was going to have to be shipped in, and there's no guarantee on the other side. So he absolutely agreed that, kind of thanks for the wisdom there. And I think this will help other people too. It's a stay in your lane thing. What works for you,
Yeah. Well, and maybe that's worth talking about is different grain feeds, because I think where you're at in the country is going to change things in a big way. So, for example, I'm in northwest Missouri. I'm the southern tip of the Corn Belt. I've got a field across the street from me that probably does 300 bushel acre corn.
Wow.
And so it's cheap and it's very abundant. And in general, I mean, that's, there's a reason the commercial industry these days, pigs are mostly just fed corn and soy. They can both be produced with good yields pretty efficiently. It's very standardized and widely produced and available. And I'm not enough of a nutritionist to say this with expertise, but for some reason, corn and soy together are very close to like a complete nutritional profile for pigs. Basically, it has to do with like the amino acids and the amount of energy that's in corn, that without adding extra, minerals and amino acids and stuff like that, you can get pretty close to an ideal pig diet with just corn and soy. So that is why it is really, really prevalent. And so if you're going to substitute other things, you just need to be mindful of that, and that's why it's going to cost you more. But that being said, there are the other parts of the country where corn and soy is not as prevalent. And I think that's why we see a lot of our members who are feeding alternative feeds, like Rebecca, they're out in the Pacific Northwest, or Montana or something like that, because up there in the north, they're growing better things that you can substitute, things like barley and oats and wheat, field peas and stuff like that. But that may not be available in your particular region.
That's a very good point too. I love that we're not standardizing things. I also think the Meishan is its own breed of pig that I have seen that if it's a commercial feed, it may not be the right feed. Meaning, going back to the mill and the anti-fat pigs. We don't have that with the Meishan. I do want to pick your brain on something else in terms of corn. I have always shied away from feeding just corn, and understand that in pigs in general, you can't overfeed corn and it can make the fat weird regardless of the breed. Do you have any thoughts on that or information along those lines?
Yeah. So, I mean, corn has always been a great... In fact, I have books from the 1880s that talk about breeds of pigs, and it says if you see them in the Midwest, they're probably bigger because they're corn-fed. That joke about Midwestern people being corn-fed and bigger, that comes from that. It has always been a really effective feed source for pigs, but it is not on its own enough. And so that's why I use the soy-based Purina thing, is that you need more protein. I think corn is only on its own about 7 to 9% protein.
Okay.
And it's not just protein that you need, it's specific types of amino acids. Like, lysine is kind of the main one. I think it's arginine after that, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head. And so soy not only has more protein to put you up to that 16, 18%, it also has some of the specific amino acids that you need.
Yeah, so I always suggest that you don't free feed corn just to feed or have it as your only source of feed.
Right.
And that would be why. It's just not enough of a nutritional profile to really do what the pigs need.
Well, and then the other effects of that are that, when you feed excessive calories and deficient protein, you get a pig that's less muscular and overly fatty. So you're going to get, a ton of back fat and really fatty bacon. And it's going to deteriorate your carcass quality. Yeah. The other part is that you were talking about the weird fat, and I think you can finish pigs on corn, and you don't have an issue with the quality, depending on how picky you are about quality. I mean, we finish all the pigs in America on corn, basically, but there are people who have an interest in like the health concerns. People who don't want a lot of omega-6 in their diet are turned off by pork fat because it can be really high omega-6. I have a whole video on this about why Meishan pork is probably the healthiest on our AMBA page if people want to know more. But basically, a corn-fed pig is going to have an omega-3 to 6 ratio of about 1 to 14. Sometimes commercial pigs, because the extra ingredients they get, can be as high as like 1 to 40. But when you removing corn from the finished diet in the last 8 weeks, like I do, is the easiest way to bring that down to like 1 to 5, 1 to 8.
I know that we're in the works of testing more of our products and trying to put that program together this year. And I think these are some of the really exciting things that once we can figure all that out, that we'll be able to understand more. Let me go back and say when Jonathan is talking about his other videos, that's on the YouTube channel, This will also upload to the YouTube channel, but it's just the American Meishan Breeders Association at YouTube, and there's tons of videos there with lots of knowledge in them. All right, so back to the basics here. Some of the things that we've made note of is talking about proteins and amino acids. I feel like the general thing I can say about protein is much like people in pigs. If you want to build muscle, you eat protein. And then it's about essentially not pooping it out with fiber. And, that's kind of how you get there. And the fat, the Meishan doesn't need help making fat. It's got that all by itself. But that's just my kind of layman's term of it. Share your thoughts, please, Jonathan.
Sure. So what we know about protein with the Meishans is there was one study done on this in England. I talk about this on one of the other videos on the AMBA page. Mm-hmm. But basically they fed them too little protein, too much protein, and then they let them choose by giving them both access to both at the same time. And they found that when they fed too little protein, the pigs consumed more food and it took more feed to get them up to the same weight. It basically ruined their efficiency. They wasted feed. When they gave them too much protein, they grew slower, but they also consumed less feed. And they actually had the highest conversion rate of any of the groups researched. So they were growing slower, but only because they were consuming less, and they were getting more pounds of live weight per pound of feed consumed than anything. And then when they were given free access to both, they found a protein level that was kind of in the middle, and what they found was they grew the quickest, but not necessarily the most efficiently, because they would convert it better than the low protein, not as well as the high protein, but they would consume more pounds in a day, and that would allow them to grow quicker. Mm-hmm. So that's why my program has always been based around, or I feed higher protein, is that, like I said, my concern is not growing the pig the quickest, it's using the least amount of grain in the process. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I do have fiber and other stuff in there, and I it's not just that I want to be more efficient, it's that I would rather err on the side of too much protein than too little protein. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, as I was saying with protein, it's not just crude protein, it's the specific amino acids. Lysine is the primary, arginine I think is the second. That's a question for your feed supplier and an actual nutritionist, which I am not. But just be aware that your feed should have amino acid balance. But kind of like I was telling you with your feed tag and the probiotics that are in it, most commercially produced hog feed is balanced in that way. That's only an issue if you're making a custom mix. I know some of our people, like in the Pacific Northwest, you actually do need to consult like a nutritionist if you're kind of inventing your own mix, so to speak.
Yeah, we have a member in Kentucky. Yeah, Kentucky. He found a huge copper deficiency in his area and actually lost a sow from it. Wow. So in making a custom blend, that happened. So yep. Yeah, and the state vet's the one that educated him on that.
Yep, and so that's a great point. It's not just amino acid. There's different mineral levels. There is more to it than just protein and carbs. But your point on fiber I want to get to, because that is something I have studied a lot. And I think it's really interesting, and it's kind of one of the most studied things in pig diets right now, is that fiber has traditionally been considered an anti-nutrient, which means that it basically blocks the absorption of nutrients. Mm-hmm. So if you, for example, the old study was that with every 1% over 5%, you lose 1% of protein. So what that means is that if you have, below 5% fiber, 16% protein feed, you use that as the baseline. If you have 7%, that's 2% too much fiber. That actually feeds more like 14% protein. Because for every percent you have above 5% of fiber, you're basically losing 1% of protein. What we're starting to learn is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. For one, Meishans are unique in their ability to digest more fiber than other pigs. So like the studies I've seen show that even as piglets, they can do up to 7.5%. But once they hit that 150 pounds, they can actually do as high as like 20%. Granted, it has to be certain kinds of fiber, but that's why I raise my pigs on concentrates until they're 150 pounds, and then that's when I rely heavily on forage, is because at that age they're able to. Now it does come down to specific kinds of fiber, and the way they differentiate it is insoluble fiber versus soluble fiber, which is kind of because it's basically, the difference is that soluble fiber is water soluble. So sources that we think of in like the human diet, think of like chia, flax, or oats, how they turn into like a kind of a sticky mucus when you add water to them. That's the soluble fiber. Okay. If they don't do that, then you have insoluble fiber. And so pigs can basically digest that soluble fiber much, much better. And it's also, like I was saying, it's a prebiotic. It feeds the probiotics in their gut, so it's actually a good thing to have in their diet. But as far as feed ingredients, you have that in oats, you have that in barley, you have it in wheat middlings. And examples of the fiber they shouldn't have would be things like soybean hulls, cottonseed hulls, any kind of stems or straw. And so I think they honestly understand this, or at least have an instinct for it, because when you see them on pasture, that's why they're going for the tender baby stuff. Because the stemmy stuff is basically just going to block their absorption of both protein and energy, carbohydrates.
Interesting. You were so technical on this stuff. In the end, I'm going to need you to simplify it for me, being a newbie trying to get to where you are. I do want to talk about mycotoxins. All these things that we've talked about in terms of ferments, soaks, sprouts, and even just your grain bin, and that's something when you get back to those tons of feed you have to consider, is mycotoxins. And that was something that I was introduced to when I took over in 2020, because Rico had felt that he had exposed the foundation herd to mycotoxins, and he likely did. So all these things are sensitive to those, and essentially the bottom line is, if it's breeding stock, don't feed anything moldy, right?
Especially sows.
Yeah. That it can essentially make them infertile. This is something big in commercial operations. I didn't find that there was any vaccine or any treatment for it. What I actually did was fed bentonite clay. That was the only thing I could find on it. And it didn't hurt the pigs by any means. Did it maybe help them look better? Sure. Did it fix the problem? No. When the foundation stock that came here was pretty much done breeding when they got here in 2020. So do you know of any other things that you would suggest on that, or any other thoughts?
Well, it's complicated. You can, corn tends to go moldy. And so you can get it just through your supplier. That is going to be your biggest risk if you're feeding quote unquote free byproducts that somebody is giving you. Brewers grains can get really moldy if someone's giving away spent brewers grains. So that's always the risk in taking away free byproducts from someplace. But it can also get into purchased feed pretty easily. I think storing all of your feed in a dry place is really important. If you're using a grain bin, cleaning it from time to time is really important. There are purchased additives you can use. I can't think of it off the top of my head. I think they're called binders, but basically they bind to and eliminate the risk of mycotoxins. They have been shown, if there aren't mycotoxins in the feed, to bind to nutrients. So you could be paying money to waste feed if you don't have a need for it. But once it actually impacts the pig, I don't know what you can do about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was thought that this came from essentially like a pretzel company, that had a mold on it. And bread stores, I do have those close by me, and sometimes I will buy the treats for the pigs, but I only buy the cake, as they call it, because the bread might have a mold on it. And there's so many things on the bread now, you may not even see it or know it. So that's just something to be mindful of, is managing mold in your breeding stock. Now I tell people, if it's meat pigs, and you're growing out your barrows, I don't think it matters at all. It's just making sure that your breeding stock is not exposed to that if you can help it.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to some alternative feed thoughts, and I think we're going to make this a whole nother podcast, especially with a couple of the other members doing this. I think you've answered part of this. I really just want to say, Jonathan, what's the big deal? Why are so many people so anti-corn, soy, and wheat right now? It just seems like all the basics are bad, and it's what pigs live on. And where's it coming from?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think there are like environmental concerns about the agricultural production of these things. Mm-hmm. But that's honestly what kind of because I started feeding non-GMO, and in recent years, I mean, because so much of my pigs get their diet from forage, a lot of their diet is non-GMO, but that's just because it's forage. Mm-hmm. The reason I went back to commercial corn over non-GMO corn was that the people around me that were producing it stopped, which means that I was going to have it shipped in from, northeast Missouri, as opposed to, 10 minutes down the road that buys all their corn from, mm-hmm. within 10 to 20 miles. Mm-hmm. And so if your concern is like, I don't know, fossil fuels in the process, mm-hmm. shipping it from across the state doesn't make that better. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I don't know a lot of non-GMO producers that are competitive at all with the people in my neck of the woods. So if you're farming 3 times as much land to make the same amount of corn, mm-hmm. that's not more environmentally sound just because of the sheer amount of resources that go into it.
Yeah, and I just don't see that the results are the same on the hogs. Generally, the feeds that are that way are not producing, what I'm getting. We just ran 3 hogs at 16 months old that were 319, 354, and 358 hanging weights. I mean,
I find it's actually kind of worse. I don't think there's a comparison with the corn, but part of the reason I stopped feeding non-GMO was because I started using this Purina product, and I couldn't find a non-GMO source that wasn't 3 or 4 times more expensive, mm-hmm. and even then that was as balanced with the minerals, the probiotics, and incorporated the same technology as what I'm feeding now.
Yeah, I mean, I understand soy. Mm-hmm. I think it's the one that's mostly considered harmful to humans in terms of like developing children, things like that. I've heard that about soy, that it's like the dirtiest out there. Have you ever heard that?
Not really. No. Okay. I'm not sure what the specific. It's so hard to say because these days, everyone just has so many different influences, mm-hmm. And so many different reasons. I think the other side of the corn and soy debate is just that people don't think it's very good for human consumption. Uh-huh. And so that itself is complicated. For a while someone was telling me about like basically hormone mimicking, or basically plant hormones that mimic human hormones that are in soy protein. Mm-hmm. The issue with that is that there's more actual hormones in dairy products than there are plant hormones in soy. Mm-hmm. So if you're not eliminating dairy from your diet, why you would go after soy first doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest concern that I'm on board with is like the omega-6 factor, that when you're feeding corn to pigs, you're going to have a higher omega-3 to 6 ratio, which may not be ideal for human consumption. But that doesn't matter if it's non-GMO or organic. At that point, those products are going to make the same result. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of different reasons that a lot of people have different preferences. Mm-hmm. I'm not really here to tell people what they should or shouldn't value, should or shouldn't produce, but I think, as a breed association, our best advice is that if you are going to find one of these alternative feeds, just make sure you have an audience that's willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And like I said, there are parts of the country, like especially up in the north, where it kind of makes sense to do something like this because that's what's probably more readily available in your region.
Yeah, and having visited Oregon, it definitely is a culture that is more about paying a farmer a fair wage for the work that we do with the Meishan, whereas the Corn Belt, for example, with a heavily commodity area, it can be an uphill battle that you may not want to take on because it's just, your apples and oranges out there with what you do. So I think we need to, let's invite those folks on here. I think they would enjoy joining us, and we'll get some feedback from them on why it is that they choose their feed programs that we do. Looks like, Jonathan, you might have froze, but I think you'll probably be back here in just a second. So I am going to keep talking. There you are. You're back.
Sorry.
No problem.
No, I think I lost you there for a second, but what you were saying is absolutely right. Like, we have people that are out there in Iowa, Indiana, places where there's a lot of confinement operations. Mm-hmm. And when they're selling sausages made from downed sows for $2 a pound, that's just hard to compete with.
They paid 80 cents a pound. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I see that through. I have access to that stuff with the retail store. I don't touch it. I don't mess with it. I just consider it a lower quality. It's not what I'm about. But when you can start buying pork for under $1 a pound, wow, we certainly can't produce it for that. So yeah. So Jonathan and I had kind of just jumped on in, talking about some other things, moving on to the alternative, the end of our alternative feeds thoughts about food waste and brewer's grains, pasture as feed. I think we've kind of touched on that some. Brewer's grain, I feel like you've talked about it in terms of maybe fiber and content in the diet, but I don't know that we've really explored that. So what else would you add on those subjects?
Brewer's grain's a little bit complicated. I would not rely on it for anything. Mm-hmm. Where I think it's probably most useful is just like a filler, especially for older adult pigs. Mm-hmm. Like you said, an adult fully grown boar, I wouldn't want to feed more than like 2 pounds per day of corn. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I give them the brewer's grain. It's not doing a lot nutritionally, but the fiber gives them satiety. So basically it makes them feel full without overeating. And I talked about with Max, you don't want the boars getting too big and fat because then they put too much weight on the sows. Mm-hmm. So that's the one area where I found brewer's grain to be the most effective, is basically just a filler for your older breeding stock.
I love that we're taking the conversation to a different level with that boars, you don't need to feed them like a sow.
Right.
That there's definitely a good reason behind that.
But you do have to be, like I said, you have to be cautious about mold because it's wet and it's, inoculated with a ton of different things. And then also, we haven't said, but feeding food waste is also illegal in the United States.
Yeah.
It's different state to state. Sometimes you can't even feed vegetable scraps, but I know federally the law is if it comes out of like a restaurant that does animal products of any kind, it has to be cooked and you have to have a license before you can feed it to pigs that you sell. Now, if you're just raising pigs for your own family, that doesn't really apply to you. Yeah. But if you're doing it as a business at all, feeding food waste in the United States is typically illegal. Yeah. And you might even want to look into whether or not you can feed produce and stuff like that, because that's different state to state.
Yeah. I've imported pigs to most states in the U.S. In doing that, you have to meet each state's import requirements. And it's not uncommon that one of those requirements is that I guarantee that these pigs are coming from a facility or farm that does not feed food waste. It's not allowed I think it's the potential zoonotic part of it, right? That something could potentially cross-contaminate or make the pig sick if a human maybe, had strep or something and was eaten, and then that gets put in the bucket, it could carry to the pig.
Well, it's a source of parasites. Okay. So, in the United States, the reason everyone was so worried about eating undercooked pork for a long time was because we traditionally fed what they called tankage to pigs, which was basically scraps from the local butcher shop. Mm-hmm. And when you feed meat to pigs, you can feed it if it's cooked, but uncooked meat, basically it develops parasites, and then when the pigs eat it, they get the parasites, and if you eat pork that's undercooked, you get the parasites.
That's so gross. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I do what I do.
Well, and that's the other thing about the Meishans I like is they don't seem interested in meat as much as other pigs that I've seen. Like I don't see cannibalization with with Meishans like are an issue in other breeds and other farms because that's the source of it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, okay, that was interesting. All right, so we've been at this an hour, and I know some of y'all may be glazed over, and that's okay. That's the way it is when we get together. Lots of information, but hey, you can always go back and listen or watch it however you want to. But let's look at it, kind of summing it up as far as how do we feed for efficiency. Let's just recap when feed is most critical. Substitutions, I would love your take on that. I pretty much feed what I feed. And then I know we both feel strong about where to buy feed. So where would you like to start, Jonathan?
Maybe feeding for efficiency.
Okay, let's do it.
So as I was saying, to get the most efficiency, you want to make sure the sows are well fed through the end part of gestation, that they are well fed when they're making milk, and that the little piglets are very well fed for their first couple months. Because that will have a big effect on the efficiency of the pigs down the line. Also, you want to make sure that you have good quality feed, that your fiber levels, amino acid levels, mineral, prebiotics, probiotics, and that you don't have parasites, because parasites are just like the anti-nutrients. They will keep your pigs from being able to get the nutrients in your high quality feed. And you'll have the same results as if you're feeding them poor quality feed.
Do you have if you were talking to the new person that didn't have access to all the things that you do? What would you say? Is this 16% feed that I use, is that acceptable to start with? Would you say get a 14% at a certain age, or the boar should get this or that? What would be your advice to a new member?
I think for the sake of just keeping things simple, 16% is the way to go.
Okay.
You can, especially if you're getting it from like a local mill that's doing all the right things with mineral balance, amino acid balance, all of that. If you really want to save yourself some money, you could also buy some extra bags of just shelled corn or cracked corn and then mix it 50-50 and give that to your older boars, because that's going to drop your protein down to about 12%.
Okay.
But otherwise, a 16% is going to be your best kind of catch-all.
Okay.
And like I said, if you're buying quality pig feed from a reasonably good supplier, it should have all of these things in it.
Okay. All right, and then just evaluate stock, and I know you and I are available for folks to reach out to too, to ask questions. Hey, my light came back on. I guess it got hot. Oh, sorry. Okay, so just a good 16% pig feed is a great place for anybody to just start, evaluate from there, and then reach out if they have questions.
Yeah, and then as far as the substitutions, like I said, your critical times are late gestation and early in the pig's life. So if you are going to rely on pasture for a big part of their diet, or you're going to feed spent brewer's grains or some other kind of alternative feed, the last 50% of the pig's last 50% of the life of the market pig, or boars, full-grown boars especially, and full-grown sows that you're not breeding. Those are the ones that get your lowest quality feed with the most substitutions.
Okay. I like that. I'd never thought about it like that. I think I could implement that, assuming I have space in where I'm putting it. But that's a really simple thing that any of us can do without having to buy tons and get into all the other things. Very good. So let's talk about where to buy feed. And this is something Jonathan and I can tell definitely agree on. There's not a lot we don't actually, but anyhow, don't buy from Tractor Supply. I said it.
Or any other big box store for that matter.
Yeah.
I know we
Yeah.
have Orscheln's and all sorts of different stuff out here, but
Okay. Yeah, we only have the one. I think Rural King might be moving down here. I heard rumor that one was coming to Georgia.
yeah.
And you know, why is that? What I hear is that they leave pallets sitting out on the dock in the rain, and there is great concern in how the feed is handled before you get it. And I think their brands, I just don't feel like it's a very high quality. But what do you know? Why would you say not do that?
I mean, for me, it's just the cost.
Yeah.
When I look at the cost of their feed, because I get supplies from there, like to medicate the pigs or, stuff like that. But it always seems like their feed's about 50% more expensive than what I'm buying.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big reason. I know for me, it's the same. I really like my local feed store though, and I want them to be here. And and it's great service. I can text the owner and have a ton of feed delivered, kind of on demand, and that's not something you're ever going to get from a big box. So I personally.
So if you can Google like feed mill, feed supply, in the Midwest we have a lot of co-ops.
We have no co-ops. I had to ask somebody what that meant because we don't have those.
Anyone that operates in bulk like that is going to be where you want to go. I know all the ones around here, if you're going to order, it's like a 500-pound minimum. But for pigs, that's really not that much.
No. I mean, for me, I feed 100 pounds a day right now. So, that's not even a week. And I've probably got, I need to count, I've probably got 20, 25 pigs here.
Right.
So.
But I mean, even if you just have a single breeding pair and you're raising offspring of theirs for yourself, even then a 500-pound minimum isn't going to be that much.
No, as long as you have the storage for it and all those other things we talked about. So,
right.
All right. Well, what have we not talked about?
I think we've covered everything, maybe even a couple times.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. I know I need to hear something 3 times, or they say everybody needs to hear something 3 times for it to sink in. And I know that we cover these things that you talk about multiple times, and my brain just needs that to help wrap around what I could be doing, or how can I improve my feed program when I do have much more limited options than somebody in your region of the U.S. So I appreciate your patience and being willing to talk it through however we need to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So the next one, let's see if we can maybe get some members on here and talk about some of these alternative feeds. I'll reach out to them. And if you guys have any topics that you want to hear, of course, let us know. You can email us at ambameshine@gmail.com. You can find that on the website, Facebook pages, all those things. And we would love to, hear your thoughts. So thank you guys so much for listening and watching if you're on YouTube, and for your support for the amazing Meishan pig. And we will see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.